If it's okay with you, we'll start early just to make sure we maximise the time available with you fine gentlemen and lady today. Thank you very much for attending the Scottish Affairs Committee and an inquiry into agriculture in Scotland. Just for the record, who you are and anything by way of a short introductory statement. And we'll go, as is traditional, from left to right, which means we'll start with you, Mr Kinnaird.
My name is John Kinnaird. I am a practising farmer, part of a family partnership dealing in cereals and suckler cows, suckler beef, finishing everything on farm. I am also a member of the National Council of Rural Advisors. I was chair of the sustainability part of the Champions for the Future Strategy in Scottish Agriculture. I also chaired a review of the appeals process in Scotland and veterinary surveillance. And a long time ago, I was a past president of NFU Scotland.
My name is Jonnie Hall and I am the Director of Policy with NFU Scotland, and in that role I have responsibility for a range of policy issues that we pursue, but right now my life seems to be dominated by Brexit related issues, and as part of that very much the agriculture bill that we're considering today.
Grateful. Ms Swales.
Vicki Swales, I'm Head of Land Use Policy for RSPB Scotland, but I'm here today representing Scottish Environment Link, which is the umbrella organisation for environmental NGOs in Scotland, and we're very much engaged in issues around agriculture and the environment, climate change, biodiversity, etc.
Mr Smith.
I'm Russell Smith. I'm the chair of the Scottish Crofting Federation and the Crofter and Bonar Bridge in East Sutherland, and the point of our organisation is to promote crofting and to look after crofters, because crofting has proved very successful in the last 100 and odd years at actually keeping population in remote rural areas. So it deserves support.
Grateful. Well, thank you all very much for being so concise. Let's start with the agriculture bill, and I know you gave evidence the other day, Mr Hall, that was right, didn't you, to the agriculture bill?
To the Public Bill Committee.
So some of these questions may be familiar with you, so we'll maybe start with you. I mean, obviously the Scottish Government has declined to accept the very kind offer from the UK Government to take powers which have been accepted by Wales and Northern Ireland. Would you like to see the Scottish Government take the availability of these powers? We'll start with you, Mr Hall, and go around the rest of the panel.
I think NFU Scotland and myself as an individual are already very much on record as saying that yes, the Scottish Government does need to establish powers so that Scottish ministers can fundamentally develop and deliver an appropriate agricultural policy for Scotland in a devolved capacity, and whether it uses the vehicle of the agriculture bill that's here in Westminster, or whether it chooses to step aside from that and use a Scottish agricultural bill through the Scottish Parliament, is clearly within their gift, and quite rightly so. But nevertheless, the concern for Scottish farmers and crofters is that at this moment in time, the agriculture bill sits here in Westminster. Scotland has declined, or the Scottish Government has declined to take a schedule within that bill as per the Welsh Assembly Government and the Northern Irish, and therefore, without anything clear coming from the Scottish Government themselves as to what they will do as an alternative approach, that is giving some significant cause for concern. Now, we're clear in our own minds that agricultural policy has to remain devolved as it is today. We all understand that under the Common Agricultural Policy, with the regulations that are commonly applied across that, but nevertheless, within the UK, there are 4 clear settlements of the CAP and how it's implemented and operated across the United Kingdom. We're absolutely clear in our minds that Scottish agriculture needs a Scottish agricultural policy. Now, whether the Scottish Government utilises the existing bill that is being considered right now and has a schedule in there which will enable Scottish ministers to move away from the CAP after the implementation period of 2019-2020, or it utilises its own Scottish bill, then whatever it does, it has to do that with more urgency than is currently the situation at the moment. But I suspect your inquiry here isn't about finding criticism with another government, it's about finding the right way forward for Scottish agriculture.
I mean, just a couple of things on that, and I'll invite other panellists to come in a minute. I mean, there's no imperative for a Scottish bill and I think that I was referring to some of the evidence that was given in the Agriculture Bill, where I think it was Mr George Burgess from the Scottish Government said that there wasn't a burning requirement that a bill is brought forward because a continuity bill will cover that, or the old provisions in the Scottish Parliament's own bill.
But the continuity bill and the withdrawal arrangements that are in place will secure payments for Scottish farmers and crofters in 2019 and 2020 to the end of what is proposed to be the implementation period, December 2020. But it doesn't allow you to adjust or change the Common Agricultural Policy rules in any way. It allows you to continue with arrangements as they currently exist. And that's clearly the view of Scottish Government, because I've had conversations with Scottish Government in that respect. What we're after, though, in Scotland is an opportunity to move out of the shadow and on what some would describe as the straitjacket of the Common Agricultural Policy, and establish a new approach in Scotland which enables it to be more tailored to the needs of Scotland, to deliver the outcomes that Scotland requires, not only in terms of food production, but also safeguarding animal health and welfare standards, and also managing and improving what is a fantastic environment.
Ms Swales is keen to come in, and Mr Kinnaird, we'll get you in a minute. Ms Swales.
Thank you. Yeah, we feel that Scotland ultimately, to echo what Jonnie said, needs its own legislation to enact a new rural policy from 2024, which is what the Scottish Government has signalled it wants to bring forward. So we need legislation for Scotland, made by Scotland, given that agriculture is a devolved competence. Yes, we understand the Scottish Government feels it currently has the powers necessary in the interim to make the payments it needs to. But I support what Jonnie's just said, that it's becoming increasingly urgent that the Scottish Government sets out its intentions and aspirations for that new rural policy. And the Stability and Simplicity consultation which took place was very much about those short-term transitional measures. It doesn't say where we're trying to get to, and therefore it's very difficult to make any plans in a transitional phase if you don't know what the end point is that you're trying to get to. Obviously, Wales has asked for a schedule in the bill to deal with what we understand are those short-term issues, but understand that Wales also will bring forward its own Welsh legislation in due course to take forward the proposals that it's currently consulting on. So obviously agriculture policy potentially is going to look different in the different parts of the UK. And I don't see any reason why at this point Scotland should necessarily mirror the Welsh schedule, or that the English and Welsh schedules themselves should be the same. They each need to construct what they require to deliver their own policies.
Mr Kinnaird.
Clear, I think everyone would like clarity. It's just at this stage it's not going to happen. But we have to also understand there's a huge difference between the requirements of Scottish agriculture, farmers and crofters, and the requirements and processes south of the border in England and sometimes in Wales and Northern Ireland. And in our future strategy for Scottish agriculture, the champions identified very quickly that one size does not fit all. In other words, what is right for one farm is not right for another, even within Scotland. Now, you put that across the UK, and that just spins out even more. So, yes, we'd like some clarity. I believe there is an element of clarity from the Scottish Government just now, up to 2024. We, in our report, were quite clear that it should be in consultation going forward on changes that will be required, that will make farming and the rural economy more progressive and resilient going forward. If we look at the CAP in its present form, yes, it does deliver money into the rural economy, and farmers are good at one thing, and I presume crofters will be the same, that when we get money, we can certainly spend it, and we tend to spend it in the local area. So farming is very important, crofting is very important to the rural communities, but the current CAP has become a bit of a dependency. It is inefficient and it leads to inequality, and that's what has to be addressed. My biggest concern is that we rush into this and actually don't get the policies that are right, and the policies that are right for Scotland should be determined within Scotland. They should not be determined within the UK. That's a personal opinion, because farming is completely different between Scotland, England, Wales and Northern Ireland. There's fundamental differences and they need to be addressed. I don't believe this bill addresses them at all.
Teed up perfectly, Mr Smith.
Just to agree with my colleagues, you can see the case for a UK framework for agriculture in general, but as people have said, that the farming in Scotland is different from farming in England, and therefore needs its own policy. It needs to be designed in Scotland and be specific for Scotland, and that may lead to all sorts of things like redistribution within Scotland, which we would like to see. But there are aspects that are required in Scotland, like less favoured area stuff and maybe headage payments in a limited way, that aren't maybe necessary in England. So we think the policy should be designed in Scotland, and how legally that is implemented, I'm not too bothered, but it must be a Scottish decision for Scotland.
Just to clarify for us, because I think it's just to make sure that we are sure about what we're talking about. If the Scottish Government accepted the powers that were on offer them in the bill, this would only resolve issues to do with payments. It wouldn't require it to accept any of the other provisions within the bill. I know there's other issues which we'll explore, which are reserved and cover particular areas, but if we assume this accepted the powers, it would only mean that there would be a system in place where payments could be made to farmers. Is that roughly right?
That would be the case anyway, because of the continuity processes for 2019 and 2020. And thereafter, that could continue. But that means working within exactly the same situation we have under the Common Agricultural Policy today. Because you can't adjust.
What does it do? What does it fundamentally change if the Scottish Government were to go along with what the Welsh know?
The Scottish Government would be stuck in with the very rigid nature of the Common Agricultural Policy. So payments would be still very much based on the basic payment scheme, which would be predominantly an area-based payment, whereby occupation of land is almost sufficient to unlock a payment. I think there's an appetite, and I think John Kinnaird and Vicki and Russell would probably agree that we need to move away from a system of support which is predominantly based on areas of land and areas of land alone, which, as John Kinnaird said, has by and large created an inertia within Scottish agriculture. It hasn't fueled innovation, it hasn't fueled productivity, it has done little or nothing for environmental delivery. So we're looking for a new settlement, if you like, of how we support farmers and crofters so that they can continue to deliver food product, which is going to be vital if Scottish food and drink is to grow from its current 14.5 billion to 30 billion by 2030, which is a Scottish Government target, but at the same time deliver on all sorts of other requirements in terms of driving the rural economy, underpinning rural communities and delivering for the environment.
We've got Deidre, then up to you, Kirstene.
Thank you. I declare an interest as someone who's sitting on the Agricultural Bill Committee at the moment. But I wanted to ask just about your views on the House of Lords Delegated Powers and Regulatory Reform Committee's report on this bill, which was pretty scathing. And I just wondered how this fits, because Mr. Hall, you're claiming that things won't be able to change, but Stability and Simplicity, which is the Scottish Government's paper, has, I think, consultations over now. The Cabinet Secretary is considering it, taking into account those views, plus the views of National Council of Rural Advisors, Rural Champions. Don't you think, given the fact that this agriculture bill has already attracted a great deal of criticism, don't you think it's best to take time, given that payments aren't affected, to take time to make sure this legislation is good legislation and does fit the needs of Scotland's rural communities?
I agree. I agree that time should be taken, but at the same time, I would also argue that farmers and crofters are absolutely begging for a degree of certainty and clarity about where policy is going to go next, so that they can work.
Good policy? We make good policy in consultation with everyone in these communities? I'm seeing nodding from Mr. Kinnaird there.
This bill is not about policy. This bill is about power. It's about enabling powers, either by the Secretary of State or by ministers within devolved administrations, if Scotland so wished to join, as it is for the Welsh and the Irish, the Northern Irish. It's about powers. It doesn't set out policy. What we want is a situation whereby a bill, whether it's this bill in Westminster or a bill going through the Scottish Parliament, enables Scottish ministers to take Scottish decisions about what's right for Scottish agriculture. And that arguably does need to take time, but at the same time, farmers and crofters, our members, are asking us every single day, what's going to happen beyond 2020? What's going to happen beyond 2022? Where's the longer-term vision? And, farming and crofting is a long-term game. It takes years and years and years to make decisions made today might not see a return for some time to come. What sort of operating environment are we going to find ourselves in? And there is all sorts of other unknowns at this moment in time, including things like the trading arrangements the UK might find itself with, things in relation to labour.
It's unknowns. Shouldn't we be taking our time a little bit and not rushing into things in the way that this bill proposes? I mean, that's really my point.
We'll just maybe leave that there. I know Ms Swales was desperate to come in, so we'll do that, then we'll lead straight to you, Kirstene.
Well, I'd just like to echo that. I mean, I think it's about Scottish Government getting on the front foot in terms of policy, less about this bill or a Scottish piece of legislation, but actually setting out the policy direction it wants to go in. We've had 2 years now of discussions, of agriculture champions, of Griggs Greening Group, of National Council of Rural Advisors, and actually there's a great deal of consistency in many of those reviews and analysis coming forward, saying actually what many of us would like to see the future looking like. Yes, there'll be differences when you get down into the detail, but what we're missing is that direction of travel, and there's a real danger that if that isn't set soon, at least in broad terms, then we are going to waste a period from 2021 up to 2024 not being able to put in place the appropriate transition arrangements, because I think we're all agreeing that change from 2024 is required. We need to work towards that and put the right measures in place.
Kirstene Hair.
Thank you, Chair. Just a couple of points that I wanted to just clarify. So you're all suggesting from the initial questioning that if there was a Scottish schedule in this bill, that it would not restrict the Scottish Government from setting its own policy around farming. So that's the first point I wanted to ask. And the second point is around, because we don't have anything around the Scottish Parliament's programme for government around agriculture, if the Scottish Government is continuing to be unwilling to agree to part of the bill, would you like to see the Scottish Government create a schedule to use as some sort of emergency if nothing in the Scottish Parliament is passed by exit date, or would you accept the uncertainty in that instance? And I'd kind of collected that a lot of your members have obviously fed back to you that they're obviously quite concerned about this level of uncertainty.
Should I take that to begin with? I mean, clearly, any schedule that comes into the agriculture bill here in Westminster that was enabling Scottish ministers to take decisions about Scottish agricultural policy in the future must be tailored to Scotland's specific needs. It should not be a cut and paste of the Welsh schedule or anything like that. It needs to be very clearly thought out about what that should contain and so on. If the Scottish Government choose, and I think it has to be the Scottish Government's decision as to whether they choose to do that or not, then if they choose not to do that, then clearly we will look very quickly to say, how are you going to put in place a Scottish agricultural bill through the Scottish Parliament? Now, there is nothing in the programme for government for 2018-19, so I would anticipate that finding the parliamentary time would probably be from sort of autumn 2019 onwards, with then having to go through a pretty quick legislative process to get it in place for maybe December 2020. Now, the continuity issues are, I think, reasonably clear in that payments, as I said earlier, will continue 2019-2020 under the current CAP. But if, as I think the panel have tried to express, that we actually want to move on to a new support settlement beyond the CAP, then we have to have a legal framework to do so. So Scottish ministers will have to have power from somewhere. And it's either through this bill, through a schedule, or it's through a Scottish bill through the Scottish Parliament. But at the moment, we have no clarity or certainty on what that might be or when that might come forward.
As a practising farmer, I'm very much at the sharp end. I would actually disagree with quite a bit of what Jonnie said. Yes, we want certainty. Yes, we want it as soon as possible. But at the moment, I would far rather take more time to get policy correct than actually get it wrong and have to come back and try and change what, quite frankly, is a mess. It's a mess at the moment. Let's not make the same mistakes twice. Let's look at things holistically. And there's a major thing that's required within Scottish farming, and I hold my hand up to that as well, and that's a change of mindset. Now that applies to Scottish farmers, crofters, civil servants, government, all the way through. It's a mindset change. This is an opportunity as much as it is a challenge. And yes, we need the legal framework. But if the legal framework is not correct, why should we ask our government to sign up to it? If it's correct, yes. I'm not sure it's at that stage yet by a long, long way. And yes, I think there is an element of certainty and security at the moment. That will run out in 2024. That's why it's important. I believe we should encourage Scottish Government to get around the table with all stakeholders to look at what is a policy that is fit for the 21st century. Not something that takes current powers in CAP, sticks them in Westminster and then shovels them out, that perhaps gives the Secretary of State more power than they currently have. And that's the danger I see long term. It's not just about getting the legal framework in place, it's actually what powers are left with the Secretary of State. And you can move on to the likes of the Amber Box and LFAS, less favoured area payments. That's critical to Scotland, not less so to England.
Yeah, I mean, some sort of certainty would be nice, and whatever legal framework parliaments or draftsmen can come up with is fine. But we do need to start agreeing on what's going to happen later on. I think for most of our members, they're just kind of carrying on because they don't know what else to do, because there is no guidance, there is no steer. And we hope that the Scottish Government, we assume they will come back with the results of their consultation, and that will be the start of this discussion that will take us through to the new system.
I think the timing on this is critical. I would concur with Jonnie that whichever way it's done, we actually need to get on and do the doing, as it were. If you think about the time required to implement new schemes, to introduce IT systems, to communicate that to farmers and businesses as to what's coming, to equip the civil service to be able to deliver that, it's a huge undertaking. And if we are to move to a new system from 2024, and we would support that, Scottish Environment Link wants a new framing of rural policy and support for farming and land management, then there's a huge amount of work to be done. So we need the powers and duties now in legislation to be able to get on and agree where it is we're heading in future, and then do the necessary in terms of administration and everything else. And that's hugely pressing. And the Scottish Government hasn't had the best track record on implementation of previous CAP reforms in that regard.
So just one final point, and I can take from that, is that in fact the Scottish Government could absolutely go ahead and create policy, it's essentially the initial point that I made, which would be separate to having a schedule in the bill. Now, you all, Mr Kinnaird, you mentioned that you would rather wait and have time and get the policy correct, but in fact we heard at the start around the Agricultural Champions programme, which yourself you were involved in, the National Council of Rural Advisors and many other policy groups who have consulted to try and bring together what they believe Scottish agriculture should look like in the future, and have indeed read through a number of those reports. Do you not believe that in fact all the information has been collated, the information is there, and actually what we need is policy to come through the Scottish Government so that we have enough time for parliamentarians to be able to scrutinise that, so that we have the best possible agricultural policy for Scotland and post-Brexit?
I quite agree with that, wholeheartedly agree with that. But equally, what was key in the Champions report was it is in consultation. We've, if you like, set the stepping stones in place. It's now up to government and all bodies to come together and look around at what is the right way to take this forward, and not look at farming in one, environment in another, because if I asked around this table, what do you understand by looking after the environment, I guarantee I've got a different answer from everyone. So it's actually about total policy, and it shouldn't be one in isolation to the other. I, as a farmer, would not survive if I did not look after the environment. Russell will be exactly the same. And I think we've got to look at this together. And it's not just about producing food. You've got timber, forestry, there's tourism, they're all interlinked. And that's something we picked up under the National Council of Rural Advisors, was how important they are. And the output from rural communities is almost equal to the total output between combined Glasgow and Edinburgh. So it's what rural communities contribute is considerable to the Scottish economy. What agriculture adds to that rural economy is equally considerable. And as Jonnie said, it's important looking forward and how we add value further down the food chain to Scotland Food and Drink. Exports are very, very important, and we mustn't lose sight of that.
Can I just come in there? The CAP for 45 years, and we're going to continue it for at least another 2 or 3. We're looking at 40, 50 years of the CAP having a massive influence on Scottish agriculture and what we do. But it has not done Scottish agriculture any great favours. It's created a culture of support dependency in many sectors and for many businesses, as John would allude to and the Ag Champions alluded to. It's incentivised inertia in many senses. It's stifled innovation. It's prevented new entrants. It's certainly done little or nothing for the environment. And here's an opportunity. I no longer view BrExit as a fundamental challenge, therefore we've got to change agricultural policy. I view BrExit as a catalyst for change, but clearly change has to be managed rather than chaotic, which is a phrase we use all the time. But nevertheless, we'll have to start that process of change now. Stability and simplicity of the Scottish Government's consultation is good up to a point. But we need to sort of break this oxymoron of stabilised change. We need to move away from what we currently have and build and develop a system that's fit for Scotland's needs in the future. And that has to start now.
Advisable to wait until the consultation's concluded, find out what the feedback is, what people are actually saying and what they want, and then forward and design a piece of legislation based on what's
the consultation concluded in mid-August, and there's been no feedback on that from Scottish Government to date.
But we will have to move on. This was Swales.
So on the back of that, the Scottish Government said the next step was it would set up a simplification task force and look at changes that could be made, tweaking existing schemes in the short term. Link's recommendation is that Scottish Government has a lot of what it needs. It's in all these different reports and the consultation results. It should set up something like a future farm support task force, bring the best brains together, engage with stakeholders, with civil society. We did some polling of the public. We know what the public feel about the future and would like to see farmers supported for delivering wildlife, clean environment, tackling climate change, etc. We have all of that. We need to get on and work together to actually come up with the policy for the future.
John Lamont.
Thank you, Chairman. Before I ask my substantive question, I just want to go back to you, Mr Hall, about something you said. You said it's the Scottish Government's decision as to whether to ask for the Agriculture Bill to be amended or for a schedule to be included to apply to Scotland. Is that?
I think that should be the case, and I think certainly the conversations I've had with DEFRA and with the Secretary of State for Scotland, that they are saying the offer is on the table for the but it's up to Scottish Government to accept that.
Given there's 11 of us around this table who represent Scottish constituencies, some of us with significant agricultural interests who are all very concerned about the delay and uncertainty. To deal with that, would it not be open to us as MPs to move that amendment to ensure that the farmers of our constituencies have the certainty that they need moving forward?
I would disagree. I would say because it would be Scottish Government who would have to utilise those powers in any schedule and develop and then implement policy on that, because it would be a devolved matter, then it should be in the gift of the Scottish Government.
It's still involved in Wales, but the UK Agriculture Act is still addressing the issues to give the certainty to the farmers moving forward.
But it would be Welsh ministers, not UK ministers, who will utilise those powers.
Is there any more certainty in England or Wales?
Well, there's more certainty than what we have in Scotland currently, because there is no legislation in Scotland to deal with payments, farming support after Brexit. And I'm just challenging the point that it's not up to the Scottish Government actually as to whether this is, they can have a view, but ultimately our job is to get the best interest, the best outcome for our farmers.
I would contend quite with a lot of vigour that agriculture is currently devolved and it should be absolutely devolved.
Nobody's disputing that, Mr Hall. The issue is whether, as a UK bill, and trying to get the best outcomes for our farmers, if the Scottish Government is refusing to deliver that, there is an opportunity for the 11 of us around this table, and indeed other members of Parliament, to address that uncertainty by moving the amendment ourselves. That was the only point I was going to make, just to push back in your assertion this is a Scottish Government decision, but it's clearly not. They're clearly part of it. It's a devolved policy area.
I would prefer it if it were a Scottish Government's decision.
Yeah, but if it's about getting certainty for our farmers, your members, we might need to take alternative actions. But in terms of my substantive question, it was about the suggestion from the UK Government the future farming support in England will see most payments linked to the delivery of public goods. And I as opposed to the size of the farm and the requirement to farm. I just wondered if you thought a similar scheme should be adopted or a similar philosophy should be adopted in Scotland.
Do you want to lead on that?
Scottish Environment Link thinks the English approach has much to commend it. We welcome the scope of Clause 1 and the emphasis on providing support for delivering public goods, identified as a priority, for a defined transition away from direct payments, measures to promote supply chain transparency, and although not part of the bill but clearly stated in the policy statement, the commitment to bring forward environmental land management schemes. There are areas where we think the current bill would need to be strengthened, but just from a Scottish perspective in terms of what we would like to see for that new Rural Policy 2024, we see sort of three broad types of investments. Of course, it's not saying that we replicate exactly what England is proposing. We need to make sure that it's bespoke for Scotland and fits Scottish needs and circumstances. But three broad types of interventions: sustainable land management payments, including support for specific types of farming which are beneficial to the environment, including organic, agroecological, and what we call high nature value farming systems, of which Scotland has a very significant share, and that's particularly farms in the uplands and our more marginal areas. Second kind of investment is to facilitate change. That's helping businesses to adapt and develop. Could take the form of grants, of capital investments, of IT and other infrastructure, helping farmers get to a better place to earn from the market, as well as being supportive for the public goods they deliver. And the third kind of investment is in supporting activities, and by that I mean the underpinning things like research, knowledge transfer, training for farmers, professionalising the industry, and very importantly providing advisory support to farmers to help them through this change and put them in a better place. So some parallels with the English approach, but also some specific issues there which we need to address in Scotland, particularly the upland marginal farming areas.
Here, Mr. Smith was up there first.
Right, thanks. Yes, we agree with support for high nature value farming and that sort of thing, because that most of the crofting areas are included in that, and the scope in there for something like LFAS or a successor to it, which might be areas of natural constraint, to try and level the playing field for these people who are a long way from the market and are handicapped by, climate, soil types, whatever, and also who have, we talk about change, but if there's no alternatives, then you're stuck with what you're doing. And if you don't support, in this case, stock rearing in the north and the west, then you lose the population and you lose the economy. You lose everything that goes with that and supports it.
Mr. Hall, you were keen to come.
Yeah, just building on the comments of my colleagues, really, fundamentally, the significant elements of the agriculture bill are clearly about policy and policy delivery in England, and they would give us significant cause for concern if they were to be applied in Scotland. Quite simply, Scotland's agricultural landscape is very different to that of England and the rest of much of the rest of the United Kingdom. That's the reason why we must have agricultural policy delivered and in a devolved capacity. There is clearly a trajectory within DEFRA England policy thinking that they want to phase out direct support payments over a 7-year period and replace it very much with the public goods for public support for public goods approach, and that's quite clear within the bill. Now, if you did that or took that very distinct and very clear first and fast approach in Scotland, London calling again.
The clash. Apologies.
No apology required. And therefore, if we took that very similar approach in Scotland, that would be extremely detrimental in many senses for huge tracts of Scottish agriculture. Whilst a lot of the east coast of Scotland could benefit from an approach taken in a similar way to much of the policy being talked about for England, the vast majority, given that 85% of Scotland is a less favoured area, and vast majority is based on grassland farming and extensive rough grazing farming in many situations, then that approach would be disastrous in many senses. The beef and sheep producers of Scotland would not thrive in any sense under that approach. Nevertheless, we do need to move away from the current system, which is predominantly area-based and does not take account of how land is farmed, or does not incentivise and encourage how land can be farmed in a way that delivers sustainable outcomes in terms of the environment, but also sustainable rural economies in the rural communities. So we need to move away, but we need to move away under Scotland's terms that is fit for Scotland's needs.
John? Mr. Kinnaird, sorry, Mr.
This might surprise one or two people, but I actually agree with most of what Vicki said, apart from environmental lead. I don't think it should be environmentally led, because that then suggests that environment is ahead of food production, which it shouldn't be. Food, the primary role of farmers, the majority of farmers and crofters, is the production of food, at the same time looking after the environment. That is key, and we have to have a policy that works together, not in isolation. And you look at soil health, animal health, these are all environmental gains if they're done properly. A lot of our soils, not just in Scotland but across the UK, need to be improved, and that should be done by incentivisation, not by legislation. And the same would apply to anything to do with environment. It should be what's right for a farm, what's right for a croft, what's right for the community. That's what's important, not being driven simply by an environmental, whatever that may be, programme, and that is wrong. The other thing that's completely missing, just to follow up on John's question, is there has to be investment in careers. That there is a career in agriculture. I'm not talking about just farming and crofting. You can look at food processing, science, research and development. That's a career in agriculture, but not many people look at it that way. And we have to remember we need a lot of investment in careers.
So in terms of the balance between using the financial support system to support public goods and food production, I mean, what is that split in your head? I mean, what should take priority?
I would agree with John's comments, but equally I'm not averse to Vicky's comments either. It is not an either-or. If we get the policy...
What the balance should be. I'm not asking you to choose one or the other. I'm asking how you think the pot should be divided.
Well, if you start to deliver policy through more efficient agricultural production, at the same time as incentivising environmental delivery, rather than it just being on an area basis we currently have, then those things can work coherently. You know, John's points about soil health and so on, efficient input use, will take huge strides in addressing things like diffuse pollution, climate change issues, as well as measures that are put in place to safeguard habitats and biodiversity. We've got to get away from this, it's one or the other. They're not mutually exclusive. If you, a more efficient agricultural system is much more benign to the environment and can deliver some real positive outcomes.
For example,
just before you do, I'm just wondering, we've only got to 20 past because we've got the Cabinet Secretary going to join us by video link at that point. So you're not all obliged to answer all the questions, and when members of the committee are asking if they want to ask particular members of the panel, that will be helpful. So we'll maybe just move on then, because we've got lots of questions that we've designed for you, if that's all right. And we'll come over to Mr. Ross Thompson.
Thank you very much, Chair. We've heard very loudly and clearly that there are a different set of needs in relation to Scottish farming. The landscape is different, and therefore there's already been some divergence in how the CAP is implemented in Scotland compared to the rest of the UK. And actually, given Mr Hall, you said in your evidence already this morning that has done Scottish farming no favours because of the inertia you said has helped to facilitate. How well do you think this divergence to date has worked?
It has worked well in some respects, in the sense that Scotland has made some policy choices over particularly over the last 10 to 20 years, let alone the last 45 years, that have allowed it to set a different tack from the rest of the UK. And that's been critical for our livestock sectors and our uplands in particular, because we do have a less favoured area support scheme in our Pillar 2. The rest of the UK doesn't utilise that measure. but we have, and it remains a vitally important tool in maintaining, and I stress the word maintaining, flocks and herds in more disadvantaged areas and everything that goes with that, as Russell and John have already alluded to, as well as delivering high nature value farming in many senses. Equally, things like coupled support schemes, beef calf schemes since 2005, essentially rolled over since, and more recently what we have is a ewe hog scheme for the uplands, the really hard uplands. And that, again, has helped deliver support to those who are genuinely active in these harder locations. Having that ability, having that flexibility in delivering support in that way, it has been really, really important. And we must have that flexibility, that divergence across the UK. And that goes back to the whole fundamental questions about having the devolved capacity to do things that are right for Scotland, and for Scottish ministers to take those decisions in consultation with stakeholders. We might disagree to some degree on the exact detail of that, but having that ability to do that is fundamental.
On that very, very point, do you think a similar level of divergence in the future would be able to cater for the needs of the Scottish agricultural sector? Or does the shift in the policy objectives as outlined by Michael Gove and the UK government mean there should actually be scope for further divergence?
I would like to see further divergence in terms of how support is managed and delivered, but I would not like to see divergence in terms of the regulatory frameworks, etc., that govern what we do around things like pesticides, animal health and welfare, and things like that. I think in order to protect the integrity of the UK internal market, we have to conform to the same standards of operation across the UK. It would be farcical to have different traceability regulations for livestock in England as of Scotland, or pesticide use in Northumberland versus Berwickshire, for example. But thereafter, how we actually support and incentivise our farmers and crofters to take certain actions and to operate their farms and businesses in ways that deliver the food production to fuel the food and drink sector at the same time as managing our environment and delivering for our rural communities and economies, that should be where the divergence is.
Thank you. Right, Ms Swales had her hand up first. It has to be very quickly because we're going to have to go on.
So I think it is likely there will be greater divergence as we look in future, but just one point where we may actually want some greater sort of commonality across the UK is certainly in terms of agriculture policy in each of the countries having a high level of environmental ambition. A lot of the discussions around divergence have focused on impacts on the internal market, but there are other areas that are particularly important, and these relate to compliance with international obligations, such as the Aichi targets around biodiversity and the Paris Agreement on climate change, and also ensuring that there's effective management of common resources such as soil, air and water and biodiversity across the UK. And that may be one area where there is a need for some kind of potentially non-legislative UK framework and consensual agreement by the four countries to work together on those fronts.
Mr Smith, do you want to come quickly?
Yeah, just very briefly to illustrate the point that was made, that Elfast in Scotland, certainly in our croft, what we get from selling sheep and what we get from our basic payment covers our costs of running the unit. The Elfast is the profit. So without the Elfast, we'd stop.
Dr. Sheppard.
Good afternoon. I was going to ask this in a bit, but it seems more relevant now, actually. I want to, this is slightly tangential, but it is relevant to the discussion that we're having. In preparations for BrExit and the agricultural bill, I mean, I'm hearing a lot over the last 40 minutes about the differences of in Scotland and the need to have, you can't have one size fits all. You can't just cut and paste a DEFRA framework and put it on Scotland. So I think we all get that. But the fact is that the reason really why the Scottish Government isn't engaging with this bill is because the discussions on a joint framework are not going well, shall we say. And my understanding, we'll be talking to the Minister in a minute, but my understanding is that at the heart of that difference of opinion between the Scottish and the Westminster governments is precisely this question about how the frameworks will protect the space for different policies and arrangements to pertain in Scotland and not be constrained or directed by a UK framework. So
what I'd like to ask you is, do you have any suggestions as to how the frameworks might work in order to protect the ability to do things differently in Scotland, which you seem to regard as quite essential?
Ms. Swales had her hand up first. We'll come to Mr. Morrison.
Can I just focus a little bit in terms of that on the intergovernmental mechanisms, because I think that's a really important point in terms of this kind of cross-UK working, and it goes to the heart of UK frameworks and the extent to which they're agreed or they constrain activity in different places. I mean, there's a real problem here. The Joint Ministerial Committee agreed a set of principles broadly around UK frameworks, but the mechanism for that working just isn't there at the minute. We basically, I think, need revised terms of reference for that process, new sets of guiding principles for those intergovernmental relationships covering transparency, accountability and a commitment to cooperate in a spirit of trust. We need some fixed timetables for meetings and jointly agreed agendas. And I think if we had that, then we'd be in a better place across the UK for these sorts of decisions to make and to avoid some of the contention that we've seen already.
I would echo what Vicki just said there. I mean, clearly there's 24 key areas where civil servants from Scotland and the UK governments have been working very closely behind the scenes in the so-called deep dives to try and iron those things out and issues out. And getting to the point where we do have common frameworks, the key for us in that is not to have the common framework, but have them commonly agreed frameworks. And it's then the ongoing governance of those frameworks which is important. Now, is that a government issue or is it a governance issue? And how do we actually set up a situation whereby we have the governance of those frameworks going forward, almost taken out of the hands of Westminster and Holyrood, but done in a way that's transparent and clear and open, as Vicki suggests. And there's been a lot of thought gone into this already. The Royal Society of Edinburgh have produced a document very recently, which they've provided as evidence to the Scottish Parliament's Finance and Constitution Committee on how and ways in which governments can be worked through on these important issues. But it's quite clear that, and I'm sure we'll come on to this in other aspects of the Agriculture Bill, that a Secretary of State for the UK government should not have unilateral decision-making power over what happens over devolved administrations when we're talking about commonly agreed frameworks or indeed the devolved delivery of agricultural policy.
Thank you. David Duguid.
I was going to ask something about, we spent the first 25 minutes of the session talking about exactly how we transfer powers to the Scottish Government. I think we can all agree that in the interest of the Scottish farmer or indeed crofter or the Scottish public, I think the Scottish agriculture industry needs to have as much input as possible, as absolutely possible in the decisions of future policies. But put that aside, there's already been some divergence in how CAP is implemented in Scotland. But do you think there's a limit to how much divergence is actually possible within the UK without causing market distortion?
Sorry, if I can come in there. I think given the amount of money we currently spend on potentially on schemes that might disturb or distort the internal UK market. I'm thinking particularly of coupled support in Scotland, which is the only part of the United Kingdom that currently operates any coupled support through the CAP. Given the amounts of funding that goes into that, I think it has little or no impact on the internal market at all. At the end of the day, the European regulations that allow Scotland to deliver coupled support are all about maintaining rather than increasing numbers of livestock in Scotland. They are deliberately set in such a way as they should not be see an increase in production. And if you look at the fact that we've had beef calf payments since 2005 in Scotland, so 13 years down the line, we've had direct support, coupled support going into our suckler herd in Scotland, but yet over that same period we still continue to see a significant decline in suckler cow numbers. So in itself, those direct support payments are having no adverse impact on the UK internal market because we're not driving up production.
Does anyone else come in on that before I ask my next question?
You will see greater diversions in markets because it's a different production system and a different market we're aiming for. That's almost inevitable.
And what kind of market distortions should we be looking out for?
Well, anything that gives an unfair advantage or disadvantage to producers across the United Kingdom. At the moment, a beef producer in Dumfries and Galloway can get a payment on his calf. A beef producer 20 miles down the road in North Cumbria can't. But that has little or no impact on the relative, no impact at all on the relative viability of those two agricultural businesses, because there are distortions all over the place, because the payment per hectare that the Cumbrian farmer gets over the Scottish farmer is already different as well, because they have a higher payment rate per hectare. So we've already got not market distortions. We already operate on an uneven playing field. The point is we're still playing the same set of rules. That's the key thing. So we've always got some sort of differences. It's about whether future policy creates such a divergence that it starts to create a problem. And I don't think there's enough money in the pot, let alone being directed in any one particular way to cause that particular issue to happen.
One area where I think we need to avoid divergence is in relation to some of the fundamental standards that underpin our food production and farming systems in terms of environment, food safety, animal welfare. I don't think it's in any of our interests, nor those of consumers, to see a race to the bottom with one part of the UK trying to water down standards in order to gain competitive advantage. I mean, at the minute it seems that all four countries broadly are talking about maintaining high environmental and other standards in relation to future agriculture policy, and that's certainly something we would want to see and endorse.
Yeah, thanks.
Can I just add on that? That's just
Very
trade
quick.
with the EU.
Yes.
Christine Jarr.
I'd like to ask, how would the Scottish agricultural sector be affected if the transition period to a new agricultural support regime in Scotland were to be different from the one the bill proposes for England?
Yeah. So my understanding is the transition period proposed for England takes it up through to 2025, and Scotland's talking about the introduction of a new policy from 2024. So on the face of it, what looks like quite different timelines. But actually, if you look at what DEFRA's published in terms of timelines, the move to a new system of phasing out direct payments and introducing environmental land management schemes is actually quite a bit shorter. So they're saying environmental land management schemes fully functional and up and running from 2025, and quite a front loading in terms of the phasing out of direct payments, with looking at some options as to whether farmers could be able to take lump sums or a bond type arrangement. So it might be actually that ultimately there's less divergence in the system than first appears when you look at those end dates.
Any the rest of you want to?
You don't have to.
You don't? No, you don't.
It depends on what we're moving towards, how long the transition period needs to be. And until we know that, then how long is it?
You mean, yeah. Sorry?
Twice the distance it is from the middle. Sorry.
So,
I think on transition, though, the important thing to bear in mind is that we don't know what operating environment UK and Scottish agriculture will find itself in. We don't know the shape of trade deals. We don't know anything of that sort. So in some senses, transition might be a need for actually we slow transition down, particularly when it comes to direct support payments, because our reliance on those direct support payments in the short to medium term might actually increase if we're suddenly exposed to cheaper imports from South America, say, in terms of the beef market, for example.
So would it be fair to say that with so much with BrExit, with the agricultural bill and with how Scotland's agriculture will be impacted, the uncertainty we face is still the biggest problem?
Without question.
Certainly very difficult.
But I think we also face many other uncertainties in terms of, for example, climate change. We know that agriculture gives rise to almost a quarter, agriculture-related land use gives rise to a quarter of emissions. We recently had the IPPC reporting saying that we need to move, we have 12 years, we need to move fast. Agriculture is an emitter of greenhouse gases, but is also part of the solution to tackling climate change. So there are some imperatives, and particularly in relation to biodiversity declines, for example, where I think we do need to get on and do things, albeit I accept the impacts, obviously, on farm businesses need to be handled carefully.
Many Scottish farmers rely on CAP for their financial stability, and we've seen over the last 2-3 years the problems it's caused because of the computer glitches, the late payments, etc. What specific guarantees to avoid that sort of situation? What specific guarantees on post-Brexit funding does the Scottish agricultural sector need to ensure stability and avoid the same sort of chaos?
Well, I think you're talking about two things there. You're talking about what sort of level of funding that Scottish agriculture needs, but then the delivery of that funding. And we need both. We've argued from day one that Scottish agriculture will continue to need at least the same quantum of money as it currently receives under the CAP, and we currently get about 16.3% of the UK's allocation of funding. That equates in terms of direct support to around £500 million per year, but it's then about getting that to farmers and crofters in a timely fashion, because it's not so much the money at farm level, it's the timing of it in terms of managing cash flow and running a business. And that's been the problem with late payments in Scotland as much as anything else. So the argument going forward is that we need some further guarantees from the UK government about future funding. The UK government is on record time and time again as saying that funding is guaranteed to up to 2022 or the lifetime of this Parliament. But there are some question marks around about that. They talk about farm support. Does that relate to all Pillar 2 measures, or is it just the Pillar 1 direct support payments, etc., etc.? Thereafter, there is no guarantee, no commitment on funding. Clearly, this is an issue for Treasury rather than DEFRA itself, and we have no clear indication about how that might be allocated across the United Kingdom, and that gives us concern.
That leads us perfectly on to my next question, which is, we know we've got this new intra-UK allocation of agriculture funding review, the Lord Buse review. What are your hopes and ambitions for that review for Scottish farming? Let me get Mr Hall to come in first.
Having looked at the terms of reference, obviously the review was way overdue. We've been asking for this review, given that the convergence dividend issue has been rumbling on since 2012-2013. Successive Secretaries of State for DEFRA have promised reviews. Even at our own AGM, George Eustice, as the Agriculture Minister, promised a review some 3 or 4 years ago, and it's only now that we've managed to coerce something out of the UK government in that respect. But we're more disappointed by the actual terms of reference of that review, because it essentially will not be retrospective in terms of the convergence uplift, and it will not look beyond 2022 and the existing commitment that the UK government have already given. So we're looking at a very tight and narrow window as to any change in allocations across the United Kingdom that the review might come forward with. However, I think trying to be more positive about this, if this review goes through and it is an independent review and it is clearly transparent in how it assesses the allocation of funding, then any decisions about future allocation beyond 2022 can't possibly ignore it. It would be quite fanciful if a future UK government ignored the outcome of a review that's going on today about what would be a fair and appropriate allocation of funding.
But the one thing we do know about this review is it would be subject to the Barnett formula, which I think we've been told is a good thing. I think the presumption being behind that particular statement is, it won't get any worse, but they've never given any indication it would get better, because Barnettisation would obviously be a disaster if that was to be the case for the Scottish allocation of that funding. I just wonder, is there any hope that Scotland might actually get a better share of the intra-UK funding?
It will always depend upon the criteria which the review determines is a more appropriate way to allocate funding, other than what we have today, which is historic. Goes back to pre-cap reform in 2005, because it was based on the old schemes of back in the day.
Desperate to come in, please.
Well, I was just
So Mr Gove had made a statement that future funding would not be Barnetised, but as I understand it, and as Jonnie's elaborated, that wasn't specifically about the remit of that review itself. But, I mean, just in terms of that future funding, which we clearly do need to know about, we'd argue very much for a needs-based approach to deciding that funding level and the amounts of money needed. Last year, RSPB, National Trust and the Wildlife Trust commissioned research to look at the costs of delivering environmental land management across the UK under that public money for public goods policy. That amounted to 2.2 billion annually, and it also acknowledged that there were other interventions that would need to be made to support farming, similar to the ones that I alluded to earlier. So we're looking at a quantum of money that doesn't look very dissimilar to the amount of money that we currently receive under the CAP. The interesting point about that from a Scottish perspective was that under that kind of system, Scotland would secure 26% of the total UK pot if it opted for a public money for public goods approach, compared to the 17% it gets now, or the 8% if it was Barnetised. So actually, because of Scotland's landscape, its environment, its farming systems, it actually has a huge amount to gain from going down an environmental land management public goods frame.
We all agreed that the convergence uplift money, this £160 million that Scotland is in fact owed, is gone. There's no prospect of getting that back. Is that your view, Mr Kinnaird?
It's an agreement. It's something that's been imposed, and it's something that should have been delivered, and if it's not part of the review, it's not part of the review, and that is a disappointment. I think as far as funding is concerned, we have to make sure that funding is maintained at its current level or enhanced. In reality, I don't think anybody would expect that to be enhanced, but if it stays at the same level, but the delivery and allocation changed to deliver more public goods that also helps farming and the environment, that has to be a positive. That's what we should be looking at.
We've really only got a few minutes left, but thank you. Kirstene Hair.
Thank you, Chair. This is, first of all, to Jonnie Hall, and then it will be opened up to the panel, but specifically because NFUS had expressed concerns around Schedule 7 of the bill, which aims to ensure that the UK complies with its WTO obligations, and which would allow the Secretary of State to impose potential limits on the level of domestic support for Scotland. And I just wondered if you could expand on what your thoughts are on this particular schedule, if you disagree with it, what your substitute would be, and if you believe it's in the interests of the wider UK for the Scottish Government to have a veto in this area, and why.
I think you've explained the situation quite neatly. We have outstanding reservations about Part 7 of the bill and Part 6 as well, in relation to what could be, on the face of it, unilateral power for the Secretary of State for DEFRA to essentially limit the amount of spending in particular policy areas, thereby limiting Scotland's or Wales or Northern Ireland's policy choices as to what it does. And we've had an awful lot of discussion and thought around this. Clearly, we want to get to a situation whereby, yes, because the United Kingdom is the signatory to the WTO, then the United Kingdom is the one that has to report to the WTO about funding across agricultural support measures. But that should be done not in a unilateral sense, but with a degree of consensus across the devolved administrations. Now, there is a fine but important difference between a Secretary of State for DEFRA consulting with devolved administration and getting some consensus or even consent from devolved administrations. And we're going back to the point made earlier by Mr Sheppard about frameworks and their governance and agreement. It's a very, very similar issue indeed. And we have concerns. We have taken academic opinion on this, and we have taken legal opinion on this. And the legal opinion is quite clear that our concerns are well founded. And therefore, that's the reason why we are using evidence at committees such as this and the Public Bill Committee last week to at least throw that out. We need to flush this out. And if anything, I think it's incumbent upon the UK government, through whether it's George Eustice, to actually explain if we're wrong, how are we wrong, to show that the situation would not be such that the Secretary of State for DEFRA would have unilateral control over allocations of funding for certain types of support measure.
Can I ask in both legal advice and academic advice that you received upon this particular Schedule 7, if you had created an opinion that was the opinion of NFUS and therefore asked them to ratify that almost, or did you go into them neutral and ask them what their position was on it?
We had questions from the 12th of September onwards. As soon as we read the bill and when it was published, the wording within Part 7 raised issues in our own mind. We then had discussions with legal folk and academics to say, are we reading this right? They took that away and have given us clear guidance in writing back to say your concerns are justified, but this needs to be flushed out.
Concerns are that your legal opinion reached, it was that this would give a swathe of powers to the Secretary of State to legislate within areas which would normally be within the devolved area.
It wouldn't be about legislating within those. It would be about being able to control the sums of money spent on certain types of support.
Would allow the Secretary of State to create a limit on what support Scottish Government could give to the
It wouldn't stop Scottish ministers from actually spending on those types of measures, but it might limit how much could be spent on those measures, and that's the issue. Now, in reality, it's arguable that that might never come to pass, but if it remains a risk, then I think, and this is my opinion, I think that is one fundamental reason why the Scottish Government are very reticent about coming forward into this bill through their own schedule.
And we've only got a few minutes left, and we will have the Cabinet Secretary, so there's 3 questions, and John Lamont wants to come in with a very brief one. I've got Ged and then Tommy.
Thank you. So this is an important point. So you're talking about these powers that the Secretary of State supposedly is going to have. Where do those powers rest as of today, with the UK being a member state of the European Union?
They basically rest with the UK government, and it's a reporting exercise. Well, the European Commission effectively is a signatory to, because we are part of the European Union.
To direct the Scottish Government if the spending pack, if the financial support doesn't comply with WTO, because the European Commission is responsible to WTO, they have that power just now. Yes. A MISTA campaign at NFUS has been running to try and take those powers away from the European Commission. Have you been running a campaign to try and take those powers away from the Commission?
Mr. Lamont, you know fine well we haven't. We've had this discussion several times already, and you know exactly our position. And you.
The question, with a good respect.
Well, you've asked it a number of times, and you don't ever seem to be satisfied with the answer I give.
For the European Commission to have that power, but an issue with the Secretary.
That's the current situation we find.
You're happy for the European Commission to have that power, but
that's the current situation we find ourselves in. Now we're talking about the UK leaving the European Union, and therefore that current power being then transferred to the Secretary of State for DEFRA. We think that would give unilateral power to then control spending. What we're not seeking to take away the power of the UK reporting to the WTO. What we want, though, is the devolved administrations to have some say in that process.
Say that the NFUS are content for the Commission to have that power, but have to take issue with the UK Secretary of State having that power.
Can I just say that there are many things that we are not content with the European Commission about?
Order. Maybe Mr. Lamont and Mr. Hall might want to continue with this conversation further offline. Last question from Ged Killen.
Thank you, Chair. How important is it for the Scottish agricultural sector that the UK receives a pro rata share of the EU's amber box allowance when it leaves the EU? And what would it mean for beef and lamb farmers if this wasn't achieved?
Come in first. That yes, if there is no, if we take the EU-hog scheme as an example, if there is no direct headage support, then we will see even more abandonment of the hills. I think of the last EU cap reform, huge numbers of sheep went off the hills. The EU-hog scheme is designed to try and keep some of these flocks still going. It is succeeding, but if we don't have that, if you don't have what effectively is a headage payment, then we'll lose even more.
Just contribution.
My understanding, those negotiations would need to take place for the UK share of the amber box, but the headroom is so enormous, I think 6 billion or something, that it would be highly unlikely to ever constrain any activity that any of the devolved countries wish to do in terms of supporting its agriculture. So it may be a bit of a non-issue in some senses.
I think we've got to be careful that it doesn't become, we don't sit back and let it become a non-issue. Any risk from likes of LFAS payments through the amber box being taken away or diminished for something else would be particularly serious to Scottish agriculture and to the Scottish rural scene. So I think we have to be very clear that the amber box is important, and it is part of WTO, which is an international obligation, but implementation is devolved, and that's the way it should stay. The amber box fits in nicely with that.
Grateful to that, and there's just so many other questions, and thank you ever so much for what was a very informative session. Again, as usual, if there's anything further you feel that you could usefully contribute to this committee, please give this in writing, but for just now we're going to suspend the sitting so that we're able to communicate with the Cabinet Secretary by video link. So order.
Meeting is currently suspended.